So we'll first look at a history of apologetics. First of all, along with each lesson, I'll give you some objectives that by the end of this unit or this lecture you will be able to do these things. First, to trace the development of classical apologetics. One of the things I want to do through our look at the history of apologetics is point out very key areas and important areas where classical apologetics was helped and sometimes maybe was hurt by what was going on. But nonetheless, I want you to see who the classical apologists were and how classical apologetics in terms of a tradition has come about. Second, to appreciate the contributions of various apologists to the task of Christian apologetics. We'll be looking at many Christian apologists, discussing them just briefly, and I would also like to reiterate that I'm leaving many out in this very, very brief survey. And third, to appreciate some of the challenges to Christian apologetics and how Christian apologetics met those particular challenges throughout history. As I said before, this is a very brief look at Christian apologetics. There is much that's being left out of it, but I think it's important for the student, particularly at this level, to get an exposure. Many people who would take Christian apologetics jump right into the arguments for the existence of God or something else, and they don't really realize a lot of the history and tradition that's behind it. So I just want to briefly expose this to you, and if you're interested in this area, we actually do offer an entire course in the history of apologetics where we go into much greater detail. One of the most important books on a history of apologetics was written by Avery Cardinal Dulles. It's a history of apologetics. He revised it in 2005, and it's probably the best work on a history of apologetics, at least the best single-volume work on the history of apologetics. You certainly can get a lot of history of apologetics by studying historical theology or even church history in multi-volume works, but this one kind of condenses it and brings out specifically the apologists themselves throughout history. His discussions at times are very insightful. He's a Catholic scholar, so he does handle the Catholic apologists, I think, fairly well. I think that if he's got some weaknesses here, I think that when he gets into the late 20th century and early 21st century apologist, from a Protestant standpoint, I don't think he brings out the differences between their approaches and methodology as well as he could have. But nonetheless, it's without a doubt the best single-volume text on it that's most approachable for students to read. And I think it's well worth your attention if you're very interested in the subject. In fact, I will follow him almost directly from his text as we go along. There are a few other ones, not nearly as good. J.K.S. Reed, who's more of a liberal Protestant in his theological understanding, wrote one, but it's not nearly as good as Dulles, and the other ones that tend to cover this are much shorter and briefer and don't do near the job that he's able to do with both Protestants and Catholic sides of this issue. So let's start in the New Testament. The time frame we're talking about is AD 54 to AD 125, and clearly the key apologist is Paul as well as the four Gospels. In fact, in Paul's writings and also as what is recorded about him in Acts, let me just read to you a few verses from Acts because people, I think, don't realize how much the early church records or the early church was involved in doing apologetics, particularly Paul, as described in Acts. Here's just a few verses. Acts 17 says this, "And according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures." In chapter 18 it says, "And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. They came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews." In chapter 19 it says, "And he entered the synagogue and continued to speak out boldly for 3 months, reasoning and persuading them about the kingdom of God. But when some were becoming hardened and disobedient, speaking evil of the way before the people, he withdrew from them and took away the disciples, reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus. And Acts 28 says, when they had set a day for Paul, they came to him at his lodging in large numbers, and he was explaining to them by solemnly testifying about the kingdom of God and trying to persuade them concerning Jesus, and from both the law of Moses and from the prophets, from morning until evening. Some were being persuaded by the things spoken, but others would not believe. Now, from this list of verses that I clearly lifted out of their context, but nonetheless, my emphasis isn't on the context, but on the fact that Paul, a huge part of his ministry from Acts 17 on, involved reasoning and trying to persuade people concerning both Jews and Greeks, believers and unbelievers. Notice in Acts chapter 19, he deals with disciples and training them in terms of reasoning and doing apologetics. This was a huge part of Paul's ministry. And because we read so much else in there, we kind of skip over these verses that talk in great detail and try to emphasize how much Paul was engaged in reasoning, using logic with both believers and unbelievers, Jews and Greeks, training disciples to do apologetics. It was a huge part of his ministry, and it's actually a huge part of the New Testament. All the Gospels, to a certain extent, include and are written to deal with the issue of answering believers and unbelievers concerning Jesus. And I think oftentimes this is not paid attention to. Jesus was argued for to be the Old Testament Messiah in Acts. There was an apologetic in Acts that was to the Jews in Acts 17, as well as to the Greeks in Acts 17. There was an apologetic to what I would refer to as an incipient Gnosticism that Paul had to deal with in Colossians. He writes about it, and he had to deal with the issue of pagan idolatry in Romans. And so these seem to be the issues that are at stake primarily with respect to the New Testament and its approach to apologetics. And I also like to point out Romans 1:18 through 20. I think this verse is extremely important because it's going to open the door for us to do and to use classical apologetics. And I really do believe that Paul was an incipient classical apologist because he recognized the foundation of using nature, of using general revelation in order to establish God's existence. Listen to this, Romans 1:18 through 20. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. I agree with Professor Russ Bush, who said of Paul's methodology that he first would ground his approach in theism, cosmologically, in having pressed the moral implications implicit in the worldview, which he does in chapter 2 of Romans. Paul then turns to the fundamental reality of divine revelation. If there is a God, and if a moral law has been revealed, then it may be cogently argued that divine revelation exists. And I think this is clearly Paul's argument in the book of Romans, at least one of the arguments that he lays down that has relevancy to Christian apologetics. First, he establishes the existence of God, that there's reason to believe that God exists. There's reason with respect to the moral law that is in every human being, and therefore it is reasonable to argue for and to conclude that divine revelation exists itself. This is from Russ Bush, his Handbook for Christian Philosophy, page 114, the quote that I read to you. In the New Testament era, the Gospel's apologetic emphasizes, Dulles will tell us, mostly concerns establishing the faith and discipline of the Christian community, of responding to objections and curiosity of Christians as well as unbelievers. This is found throughout the Gospels, and one of the purposes of the Gospel, to answer questions on the origin, the life, and the miracles of Jesus, and then to deal with the issue of his death, resurrection, and ascension in a historical way. So I think that the New Testament, and I would agree with Dulles, while you can't look at any one book in the New Testament and say it is an apologetic in and of itself completely, apologetics is found throughout Scripture, and it's a part of almost every book of the New Testament. When we turn to the patristic era, we're talking about a period of AD 125 to 500. Here, there are various reasons are given for doing apologetics with the patristic era, or the fathers following the disciples. One of their main things that they wanted to do was simply to educate their converts. In the process of educating them, they would answer questions and deal with apologetic issues. Some of this was related to the fact that people being converted to the Christian faith were actually people who were educated themselves. Philosophers were coming in that were Greek educated in Greek philosophy, and they had answers as well, and so some took up the challenge to provide them with answers with respect to the Christian faith. The church was forced to give a more reasoned justification for their faith. Also, I would suggest that emperors who first persecuted the church began to reconsider their treatment of Christians, and this in turn gave Christian apologists of the time a chance to answer them. So they formulated their answers, and much of this was written down for us. Also, it's the case that Judaism, or the Jews, continued to denounce Christianity, which gave a clear impetus for apologists to actually respond to those challenges. And so that's what was being faced primarily during this particular period. And I think Dulles points out that you can easily divide the responses that early Christian apologists made into two types. One was we would put in the category of political, which was primarily designed to explain Christianity and its practices, its beliefs, in terms of giving civil tolerance to it and more wide acceptance to it. The second was to actually respond to religious attempts to convert converts and then to educate them and to keep them as converts. They needed to engage in apologetics in order to win them and also to keep them in the faith and explain the faith to them and educate them in the faith. For apologetics during this time period, the primary opponents that were faced were paganism and Judaism, kind of an extension of what Paul was dealing with. These were the primary opponents, but you also have Gnosticism developing, and the issue of Hellenistic philosophy and somehow explaining to the intellectuals how Christianity is compatible with Hellenistic philosophy, or in some cases not compatible with it. This was what the early apologists were involved in. So I would like to describe the early patristic era as kind of a reactionary approach to apologetics. There really was no setting out of arguing from first principles to the truth of the Christian faith. That's not going to come until the Middle Ages. But in this period, it's what I would describe as a reactionary approach. An issue is at hand, whether it's related to politics and civil issues concerning Christianity, or it's something that's related to winning and keeping converts from a religious standpoint, and then issues are addressed because of a reactionary need that comes from these individuals. Kind of jumped ahead of myself with respect to this, but these were the two responses that were needed. One to win civil tolerance and acceptance of Christianity, and the other one was to win religious converts from paganism and Judaism. First one we'll take a look at, and again, we're leaving out many people. You can read Dulles' book. He covers many people. We'll only cover a few of the major early patristic apologists. One is Justin Martyr, AD 100 to 165. He wrote the dialogue with Trophy the Jew, and he also wrote two apologies. In these, he argued that Jesus was the Messiah. He refuted many misconceptions about Christianity. One of the misconceptions was that Christians were cannibals because they looked at them partaking in communion and word got around with respect to the issue of whether they were eating flesh in there, and clear misconceptions developed. And Justin had to answer these with respect to the practices of Christians. And again, he also argued concerning the messiahship of Jesus with respect to the Jew. Tertullian wrote an apology in 160 to 220, also dealt with the issue of the incarnation of Christ and other issues related to explaining Christian theology and answering the Jews and answering other people that had objections to Christianity. Probably the most predominant and perhaps the most well-educated, although he is full of heretical views, but probably the most prolific early Christian apologist is Origen, AD 184 to 254. His work against Celsius argued against a mythical view of Jesus. He argued for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. In fact, let me give you a quote from him. But a clear and unmistakable proof of the fact, the resurrection, I hold to be the undertaking of his disciples, who devoted themselves to the teaching of a doctrine which was attained with danger to human life, a doctrine which they would not have taught with such courage had they invented the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and who also at the same time not only prepared others to despise death, but were themselves the first to manifest their disregard for its terrors. This is in his Against Celsius. And I'd like to suggest that many of his argumentations for the resurrection of Jesus that are used by apologists today are not different. They're taken right out of the pages of Celsius's work, such as this one with regards to the disciples. These arguments are still used today by many Christian apologists, and they date back to Origen himself. And again, probably the most prolific apologist of this early time period. Eusebius is also quite recognized and well known for his church history, but unknown to many people that study just church history. He wrote quite a bit on Christian apologetics. In fact, he wrote the presentation of the Gospels and the proof of the Gospels, which, interestingly enough, is not included in the standard 14 or 15 volume work on the collection of the early church fathers. This one was, for whatever reason, left out of that collection, and it is just that, a proof of the Gospels that he engaged in. So he's not only a church historian, which he is most known for, but he's quite the able apologist as well for this time period between 263 and 339. John of Chrysostom, 347 to 407, wrote a demonstration to the Jew and to the Greeks that Christ is God. He is well known for his work in this particular area as well. And probably the end of this period is perhaps up to this point the most well-known as well as the most prolific, most rigorous apologist of the time is Augustine, right before the medieval period, from AD 354 to 430. Here he writes several works in terms of apologetics and polemics, that is, dealing with issues in the church, but his apologetics is what we'll focus on here, and there's probably no better work to look at concerning his apologetics than the City of God, which has really is completely a treatise against paganism that was overtaking the Roman Empire at the time. But I'd like to give you a few quotes from him that Dulles brings up in order to point to his apologetic method or his approach to apologetics, which unfortunately is often misunderstood. The first quote is from his book On Free Will. He says this: "It is necessary that everything which is believed should be believed after thought has led the way." So here he recognizes that reason comes before belief, that one should certainly reason about things and then will believe in them. In fact, he says in another place, nobody believes anything unless he is first convinced that it ought to be believed. This is from On the Predestination of the Saints, Augustine's work on that. So Augustine's approach was to provide reasons, and he argued for the existence of God and gave arguments or proofs for the existence of God, and then argued for the historical truth of Christianity through miracles and converted lives and so forth. The medieval period, during this period, we see that the Jews in the West still need to be dealt with, but we have the rise of Islam as well in the East. And during this time period, apologists will devote themselves to this. We also see that an emphasis is being placed here on a rational basis for the Christian faith. And it's here that we're going to see the first full approach and full presentation of kind of a systematic approach to defending Christianity. And this is going to come from Thomas Aquinas, but we lead up to it here in the Middle Ages. Perhaps the first person to look at it is John Damascene. John Damascene counters the Jewish objections in Book 4 of his work on the Orthodox faith. He also is the first to refute Islam in chapter 100 of his On Heresies. He presents dialogues. Dialogue during this period remains possible. During this period, it's just prior to the Crusades, and there's interaction that takes place between Christians and Muslims, and John of Damascene is at the center of this. There are clear instances during this time period of debates between Muslims and Christians. Among several in the West who authored works against the Jews during this time period, there are some. And by the end of the 11th century, apologetics against the Jews and the Muslim was really at an all-time high, even just before the First Crusade, which begins at 1095 through 1099. Anselm of Canterbury, 1033 through 1109, his works deal with apologetics as well. He is most famous for his ontological argument, but he also argued quite admirably up to this time period for the incarnation of Christ as well. In his Proslogon and Curious de Homo, he argues for the incarnation. And in this work, Dulles quotes him with respect to his approach to apologetics. He says this. This is from Dulles, but it's a quote from Anselm in his preface, Monologon. He says this, that nothing from Scripture should be argued on the authority of Scripture itself, but that whatever the conclusion of independent investigation should declare to be true, should in an unadorned style, with common proofs and with simple argument, be briefly enforced by the cogency of reason, and plainly expounded in the light of truth. Dulles continues to quote him. He says, for him, this is Dulles saying this, for him, theological knowledge was a single science. It operated by reason under the guidance of faith. But the arguments, insofar as they were based on cogent reason, could be meaningful to those who lacked faith. So here he sees clearly reason, and by that we mean apologetics, being used for those who lacked faith in order to reason with them and convince them of the truth of Christianity. Peter Abelard is next, 1079 to 1142. While he's certainly not a pure rationalist, he did give greater primacy to reason in the sense of achieving some kind of innocutive faith, Dulles says. In his dialogues, he emphasizes the ability of Christianity to convert the intellectual, and its Christianity's moral superiority is argued for in his works as well. Thomas Aquinas clearly of the medieval period is the greatest Christian apologist up to this time period, and many would argue the greatest Christian thinker up to this time period as well, and maybe some would even argue for all time. Thomas Aquinas gave the apologetic expression, especially in his Summa Contra Gentiles. This particular book was written for Catholic missionaries who were going into areas that were controlled by Muslims, and they were trying to convert them. He specifically wrote the book in terms of giving an apologetic that these missionaries could use in trying to convert Muslims. And that's primarily what it is written for. And it's the first real systematic expression that we have of a full Christian apologetic up to this time. Dulles notes that the Summa Contra Gentiles towers above all previous apologetic treatises by its absolute clarity, its perfect coherence, balance, economy, and precision. Aquinas insightfully recognized that there were some truths that can be known by human reason alone, such as the existence of God and certain things about his nature. This he covers in books 1 through 3 of the Summa Contra Gentiles. And other truths that can only be known by divine revelation. This he deals with in Book 4 of the 4-volume set, which has been verified by miracles and prophecy and so forth, which he explains there. He explicitly wrote this book to meet the needs of missionaries in Spain. Christian scholars in Paris wanted to answer the Greco-Arabic worldview, and so they contacted him to write such a work that would help them in doing this. And this found great use in missionary work and missionary endeavors, particularly in Spain and Muslim-held territories. In fact, one of the things that's been discovered is other missionaries wrote their own apologetic work, and much of it was simply copied from the Summa Contra Gentiles. His other work, the Summa Theologica, deals with theology primarily in the integration of Aristotelian philosophy with theology. There's much in there that would help us in understanding his approach to apologetics, but primarily this work is written to the beginning theological student. So his main apologetic work remains the Summa Contra Gentiles. From the 16th to the 18th century, this time frame deals with the 1500s to the 1700s. The challenges that are faced is, as we'll see, is the beginning of the Reformation, which splits the Protestant and Catholic divisions of Christendom, and they deal mostly with polemics. So there's not a whole lot of apologetics per se going on here. Obviously, there's some very important Protestant issues that are at stake here, but most of them are theological. But we're also leading up to and involved in the philosophies of the Enlightenment. What's happening outside the church in terms of scholars that are going to come onto the scene is really a rationalistic approach that's going to throw out the scholasticism of the medieval period. And of course, foremost, we can't skip over Martin Luther, primarily for his theological contributions to Protestantism, no doubt. But it's really not, but as far as we know, Martin Luther himself really never engaged in or even wrote on Christian apologetics. Of course, he's primarily dealing with the polemic issues in terms of the church against Roman Catholicism. But what I think is interesting is one of his systematizer, Philip Melanchthon, does not only systematize Martin Luther, but in the process of doing that, he grows quite fond of Christian apologetics. And not only that, but Christian apologetics in the classical sense, even going back to the approach of Martin Luther. And in his Loci Commons in 1536, he incorporates an approach to apologetics in his systematizing of Martin Luther. Following that is John Calvin, one of the reformers of the church as well, 1509 to 1564. While it's true that he really never emphasized a natural theology in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, neither did he denounce such an approach, which needs to be observed as well. Instead, he emphasized the inward testimony of the Holy Spirit to the point that he just didn't think such arguments were needed. Not that he thought thought such arguments were invalid. He just didn't think that they were needed. He did, however, argue evidentially for the credibility of both the testaments, and he remarked, in case someone needs them. Calvin did not elaborate on arguments for God's existence. He did, however, allude to them, particularly in the context of discussing general revelation. Calvin, for example, acknowledged, quote, that God manifests his perfections in the whole structure of the universe, and that it is plain that the Lord has furnished every man with abundant proofs of his wisdom. He also leveled his own arguments for the inspiration of the Bible. Specifically, Calvin addressed these reasons in his Institutes in chapter 8 of book 1, titled The Credibility of Scripture Sufficiently Proved, insofar as natural reason admits. And here he also elsewhere argued for this thoroughly through Scripture's unity, its majesty, its prophecies, and also its miracles. In fact, one commentator and scholar of Calvin, Frederick Howe, says, according to Calvin, there is, on the one hand, a pattern for argumentation and for presenting reasons for the dignity and majesty of Scripture, as well as the entire Christian theistic system. So while it doesn't play a prominent role in his approach, that is apologetics, he certainly didn't denounce apologetics or do away with even classical apologetics. At best, by not addressing them directly, he just didn't see a need for them in his approach. But he did not necessarily think that they were invalid. Now, here we also have, following the Reformers, we have the rise of what I'll refer to as modern philosophy. The influence on Christian apologetics is what I want to note here just briefly. I mentioned before René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. Descartes, in his meditations, wants to establish with mathematical certitude that an external knowable world exists and that God exists. And so he starts his reasoning, and it soon becomes evident that he is unable to establish this existence of an external knowable world. And so he argues first, starting in the mind a priori, to the existence of God in hopes of getting to this knowable external world. He is unsuccessful, and every philosopher looks at his arguments and he's completely unsuccessful. Well, what I would like to point out that I think is relevant here is the move that he makes. What Aquinas would argue for is starting with being or first principles, or starting with reality, which is undeniable, and arguing there for the existence of God. What René Descartes does is he shifts that from a knowable world and tries to make philosophy do something it can't do, and that's prove an external knowable world. That being the case, he's unsuccessful. He then moves to God. But here's the shift that's very important. René Descartes starts with, I think, therefore I am. He starts with his own thinking mind. He starts a priori in his mind and then reasons to the existence of God, or attempts to reason to the existence of God. But that's a complete shift from what the medievals did in arguing for the existence of God, such as Augustine and Aquinas. They start with reality, undeniable reality, or in their terms, they start with being and reason to the existence of God. Not with the mind, not with a thinking mind. They start with undeniable reality. And the shift and the differences are extremely important, because one is able to be successful. That is, the philosophers that start with reality are able to be successful. René Descartes is unsuccessful, starting with the mind alone. And as the Neo-Thomists that we'll get to will tell us, when you start in the mind, you'll never get out of the mind. You'll never be able to achieve the existence of God. You'll never be able to establish philosophically an external knowable world. You'll never get over the gulf or the gap that exists between the mind and reality, because you've assumed this gap exists. This gap will be played out later with regards to Immanuel Kant. But first, let's look at David Hume. What does David Hume do? Well, David Hume offers a critique of these traditional arguments for the existence of God, and he also writes a scathing critique, or what is viewed at the time by many as a scathing critique of miracles. These he does in his dialogues concerning natural religion. He argues against, contrary to arguments for the existence of God, and also in his inquiry concerning human understanding argues against miracles. Well, this wakes up Immanuel Kant from his dogmatic slumbers with regards to this entire issue. Particularly David Hume, another thing that he did is question the principle of causality, which is directly related to science, and this particularly disturbed Immanuel Kant. We'll talk more about Immanuel Kant and his influence a little bit later, but what these three men do is they start an influence that is going to affect Christian apologetics like none other. And up to this particular point, you have people in the church that are writing using Aquinas, both Catholics and as well Protestants are using their arguments, and what's happening in philosophy is doubt is being brought into the equation with regards to these arguments and with regards to doing metaphysics at all. Immanuel Kant will ultimately learn his metaphysics from Wolff, and Wolff will learn his metaphysics from Leibniz, and Leibniz pretty much gets all of what he knows about arguing for God from René Descartes. So all of this is traceable back to René Descartes and the start of modern philosophy, and these men, as Copleston will tell us in his book on Thomas Aquinas, especially Immanuel Kant, knew nothing of Thomas Aquinas and his approach concerning philosophy and his understanding of metaphysics and epistemology. So while this influence is developing outside, what's happening in the church? Well, many would look at Hugo Grotius as probably penning one of the most well-received within the church books on Christian apologetics. In fact, many would look back to him. In fact, William Lane Craig actually cites him, Grotius, as writing the first modern textbook on the subject of Christian apologetics. Grotius, in his The Truth of the Christian Religion, emphasizes arguing for God's existence. He emphasizes natural philosophy. He argues for self-evident principles because he says even the pagans accept them. He is clear, he is brief in his presentation, and much of it is written, I think, and geared towards the popular reader. And this makes his book very well received. It's very straightforward and easy to understand, unlike Aquinas for the lay reader or the popular reader, which is couched for us today in a lot of metaphysical medieval terminology. Hugo Grotius doesn't get into that at all, and that makes his book very well received. He argues against other religions such as Judaism and Islam as well. His work receives wide circulation in Europe. It is translated into many languages, including Arabic and Chinese. So it went through quite a number of printings and was widely received as a good, basic, and even popular approach to doing apologetics. Blaise Pascal, he was a French Catholic mathematician. He emphasized the personal and relational aspect to Christianity. He did not outright reject arguments for the existence of God, but he did, to a certain extent, oppose their use in apologetics. And therefore, he did not really emphasize them very much. Now, he wrote his book, Pensées, which simply means thoughts or sayings. It remained incomplete. He never completed it, but it really remains, many who look at it as a very significant contribution, particularly his insights into the existential elements of coming to faith and even to using evidential apologetics in helping people come to faith are very prominent in this particular work. John Locke and his The Reasonableness of Christianity as delivered in the scriptures. During his time period, you have the rise of deism that takes off in the 17th and 18th century. And this, of course, begins with Edward Lord Herbert of Cherbury in 1583 to 1643, John Locke responds to him, or at least to deism in general. He argues against David Hume as well. He gives arguments for the existence of God, and he bases this primarily on the principle of causality. Samuel Clarke is an Anglican. Clarke attempts, as Dulles says, quoting Dulles, to reconstruct the natural theology of medieval scholasticism. This is dating back to the scholasticism of the medieval period, on the basis of Newtonian rather than Aristotelian physics. He used highly metaphysical deductions to try to establish a necessary being, especially to answer Hobbes and Spinoza. His evidential approach largely relied on Eusebius, which takes us back to the patristic era, was where he got much of his material and approach for apologetics. Joseph Butler, probably one of the best apologists with respect to arguing against deism up to this time. He directly confronted deistic beliefs by using arguments that we would describe as being from analogy. He reasoned in Analogy of Religion, written in 1736, that if a natural religion or deism held similar to beliefs to revealed religion, then it was just as reasonable to embrace Christianity. In this context, he argued for miracles and the Christian faith as a whole. He hints at his overall methodology or method in saying this: there is no need to abstruse reasoning and distinctions to convince an unprejudiced understanding that there is a God who made and governs the world and will judge it in righteousness. For revelation claims to be the voice of God, so it offers itself to us with manifest, obvious appearances of having something more than human in it, and therefore in all reason requires to have its claims most seriously examined into it. So you can see his basic approach to deism is say that there's really no reason to reject the theistic claims of revelation, and he argues by analogy, saying that they accept some of the same things, therefore they ought to accept the revelation that is put forth with regards to Christianity. Thomas Reid is a Scottish Calvinist. His inquiry into the mind, his philosophy, which was later known as Scottish common sense realism, presents a more complete answer to Hume's skepticism. Up to this time, Hume really is not answered directly with regards to his critique. Thomas Reid comes the closest to being able to do that. His work amounted to a revival of realism that showed how far adrift philosophy had come from. This is going back to the medieval understanding of first principles and common sense realism, and showing how analytic philosophy or philosophy since the time of Descartes has deviated from that. Philosophy, according to Reid, had become so obscure that it could not see what was so obvious to the common person on the street. The first principles, self-evident truths, right versus wrong, all need to be brought back into Christian apologetics. This has obviously been forgotten because of the influence of philosophy and modern philosophy. If we bring this back in, then he puts us on the path of doing apologetics on a more common sense basis. William Paley, in a view of the evidences of Christianity, written in 1794. This remained required reading, believe it or not, for Cambridge University students all the way up to the 20th century. Following this, he gives a defense for the design argument, which he is well known for in his natural theology. In retrospect, many look at his work as not being very successful in answering Hume's objections, but nonetheless is quite influential. That brings us to the 19th century. In the 19th century, we'll take the time frame we're talking about, the 1800s. There are many challenges faced, and the primary challenge that develops during this time period is Darwinianism. The Origin of Species is authored during this time period, and apologetics must respond to this. This brings up the whole issue of scientific and biblical criticism, is also quite prevalent during this period. Existentialism comes to the forefront, as well as rationalism, quite influential and needs to be responded to as well. The first person we'll take a look at, mainly for his influence during this time period, is Immanuel Kant, who wrote in the late 1700s. He died in 1804. He really anticipated that his philosophy would be a Copernican revolution, and to a certain extent, that's exactly what it was. In his critique of pure reason, he takes on directly the traditional arguments for the existence of God, and in his Religion Within the Limits of Reason alone, really reduces Christianity to a moral religion, and looks at and diminishes its history in that book. And it also diminishes its doctrines as well in that particular book. And he becomes very influential on a number of people, particularly scholars, people who teach in the area of philosophy, and also those who end up teaching even the area of religion. So you have the rise of ultimately of liberalism because of his work as well. Many will come along and completely discard all of classical apologetics in its approach, and most of it can be traced back to the influence of Immanuel Kant and his critique of the arguments for the existence of God. No one in this period influences philosophy more, and for that matter, therefore, influences apologetics more than Immanuel Kant. To many, the critique of pure reason satisfies that demonstrations using rational thought for the existence of God are completely unacceptable, and argues for that to be the case to the satisfaction of many in his critique of pure reason. In the Religion Within the Limits of Reason, 1793, he simply cuts off the need for any historical demonstrations. So really there's a two-pronged approach of Immanuel Kant. One is to cut off using metaphysics and philosophical argumentation for arguing for the existence of God. The second approach is to really show that religion does not need to give historical demonstrations, and therefore he cuts that off there within the Religion Within the Limits of Reason alone. Instead, he shifts the basis of religion to the individual, to the communal needs for morality, rather than to the doctrines of Christian scriptures or to the historicity of Jesus. And this becomes, again, quite influential. So influential that someone following him, Soren Kierkegaard, gives up completely with regards to rational thought and Christianity. Soren Kierkegaard, following Kant, completely rejects in his philosophical fragments any apologetic that uses rational demonstration for the existence of God. And following Lessing, he rejects any effort to demonstrate truths from history, as indicated in his postscripts. That being the case, Kierkegaard is left with pure fideism. He doesn't reject Christianity as a faith, but he does reject its approach to apologetics. To get around Kant's gap concerning metaphysics, and to get around Lessing's ditch concerning history, he says one must just believe. Even if it involves a leap of faith, even if it seems absurd to do so, one simply must believe. Only this, he says, will answer the real and true human needs. One person to bring up is A.B. Bruce. He's often not brought up, and almost you would think that in the brief survey that we're doing in a history of apologetics, why not just leave him out? But when I read Dulles' work, I was amazed at how Dulles cites him as being very influential to presuppositional apologetics. Most of the work that I had done up before I had completely read Dulles' work, I would have traced it back to Abraham Cooper, which we'll look at next as being the origin of Protestant presuppositional apologetics, but Dulles traces it back to A.B. Bruce and his Apologetics or Christianity Defensively Stated. Alexander B. Bruce and his Apologetics compares 5 alternative theories to the world. He looks at pantheism, materialism, deism, Unitarianism, and agnosticism. And looks at these as against and over against the Christian view. But what happens here in doing this is he concedes to agnosticism that proofs of God are not convincing to unbelievers. Dulles observes this, and I have no reason to doubt him, as preparing the way for the reformed view and approach of presuppositional apologetics. Now, you ask, why does he look at this as being as proofs for the argument for God's existence as being unconvincing to unbelievers? Why does he do this? Mostly, you may not be able to trace it directly from Bruce back to Immanuel Kant, but the influence and the writing that is going on. Many philosophers are convinced that Kant is right, that arguments and metaphysics in the traditional medieval sense is done with. You can't do it. That being the case, apologists are going to give up these arguments left and right. So classical apologetics falls to the wayside. It's not used anymore. There are very few left that are going to argue for it. Most are going to reject it in the light of Kant. But here, don't forget that what René Descartes did, and even what Kant did following him, is not to critique the medieval arguments and starting with their understanding of metaphysics. Instead, it's to critique the approach that we start a priori in the mind only in order to argue for the existence of an external knowable world or to argue for God. This is what they're looking at as being bankrupt. This is what they're looking at as being invalid. But that, again, as I pointed out before, is not the approach of the medievals. That's not the approach that Thomas Aquinas takes towards the existence of God and arguing for the existence of God. So their critique, is not of Aquinas and his approach. This is a critique of on the failure of modern philosophy. Abraham Cooper, in his Principles of Sacred Theology, becomes very influential on the presuppositionalist. He reasons that Christianity cannot be proven to non-Christians. Therefore, he concludes that all apologetic argument presupposes Christian principles that non-believers simply cannot accept. So we need to throw out any approach that tries to argue for common ground. He says there is no common ground between the Christian and the non-Christian. And since there's no common ground, apologetics, as it has been done traditionally and classically, needs to be thrown out. And he suggests an approach that will influence others concerning presuppositional apologetics. This brings us to the beginning or into the 20th century. The time frame is the 1900s. There are many challenges faced, such as deism, idealism, and the rise of liberalism is going to be prominent in the church. The apologetic emphasis of what takes place during this time period, evolution is still an issue. Higher criticism is still an issue. Many are having to deal with these particular issues. But what also comes into question by this time is really the nature and the value of apologetics. What is the future of apologetics? If we have to give up, as the presuppositions are going to say, arguments for the existence of God, then what are we left with respect to apologetics? And towards the latter half of the 20th century and into our time period, the early 21st century, is the issue of postmodernism. And by that, I mean taking relativism in terms of truth and applying it to many different disciplines. But also what you having taken place during this time period are what are referred to as a revival of Thomistic realism in the research and work of the Neo-Thomist. Much of my presentation up to now has really ignored Catholic apologists. I've mostly emphasized Protestant apologists during this time period, but it's time to bring back or to look at what's going on and what happens in the early 20th century with respect to these Neo-Thomists, because these people become extremely important in reviving a correct understanding of Thomas Aquinas. There's an internal Catholic debate that arose with regard to the relationship between apologetics and theology. And it's these individuals, Garrigou-Legrand, Etienne Gilson, and Jacques Maritain, that become very influential, not just for Catholic apologists, but I would say that they become very influential on some Protestant 20th century apologists as well. And they revive for us a correct understanding of Thomism. They bring out from the archaic medieval language that few spend the time learning and getting to know, and they present it into a form that the modern philosopher can understand. Garrigou-Legrand helped to distinguish this distinction between the role of apologetics and theology. Dulles notes that he argued that apologetics, quote, differs from the sacred theology properly so called insofar as the apologist does not presuppose faith in his readers and consequently does not argue from articles of faith. The apologist does construct arguments that are valid before natural religion. So here he returns us to what Aquinas was doing in the Summa Contra Gentiles. That which all humans have in common, regardless of their religion, is natural reason. And that is where you have common ground and you can ultimately reason for the truth of Christianity. Not from the articles of faith, presuppositionalists would want us to do, but by returning to that which we all have in common, which is natural reason. Two French scholars, Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain, revived scholasticism that truly returned to a correct understanding of Thomism. If you read them carefully, you'll understand that much of Thomism is lost. It's lost through Catholic interpreters who completely misunderstand and set many on a course of just not returning to what Thomism was all about. Thomas was extremely hard even for his contemporaries to understand well. But these individuals take the time, these Neo-Thomists take the time to bring back a correct understanding of Thomas. Gilson, the spirit of medieval philosophy, positively shows the benefit of medieval approaches to philosophy and revelation, and also in his book, The Unity of Philosophical Experience, which I would encourage everyone to read, because it shows how modern philosophy, modern analytic philosophy since the time of Descartes has completely failed. Failed in terms of its understanding of the metaphysic of being, of understanding Aquinas, and therefore is bankruptcy in its own approach, even to the extent that these individuals are not even doing philosophy correctly and not even on the same page of doing philosophy as the medieval approach shows. Maritain likewise advocates a complete return and integration of Thomistic philosophy and understanding. This will be influential. These three men and others like them are influential both on Catholic theologians as well as Protestant apologists. B.B. Warfield sticks to the classical approach, does not deviate from his classical approach to apologetics. In fact, he, in an encyclopedia, writes an article on apologetics, and I'll tell you the article that he wrote, I think he wrote it in like 1901, in a Encyclopedia of Religion, is probably better to read today than some of the modern articles that are being written on Christian apologetics. It's right to the core, doesn't mince words, goes right to the point of Christian apologetics as being the demonstration that the Christian religion is true, and by true he means absolutely true over and against all other religions. So here his approach is he's mostly a theologian, but he greatly writes and respects classical apologetics, and he defines it in this encyclopedia article and makes it a foundation for approaching theology, particularly systematic theology. C.S. Lewis, following World War II, in fact during World War II, begins by giving radio messages on Christian apologetics, and he's the first to really take a popular approach, or to take apologetics and deliver it to a popular audience. His book, Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain and Miracles, are widely read and distributed today. They are classics in popular apologetics. He is a brilliant writer. Anyone in apologetics that studies apologetics at some point has got to read these books. They are still relevant today. being a brilliant writer. Dulles says, Lewis, as a brilliant stylist, Lewis reached a vast number of readers who would not have found time for technical theological works. The technical works of B.B. Warfield, or even the Catholic apologist at his time. Unfortunately, most of what is being done on apologetics in Catholic circles as well as Protestant circles is confined to the seminary. But C.S. Lewis breaks ground. He breaks open those doors and takes apologetics and puts it into the hands of the layperson. And really, much of what apologetics is in the later half of the 21st century follows his approach. It's taking apologetics, getting it down to the level that the layperson can understand it, and if the layperson can understand it, then they can use it in apologetics and evangelism. Also, I should reiterate or point out that C.S. Lewis is in the classical apologist tradition. He favors the moral argument and does a brilliant job of delivering the moral argument in Mere Christianity. Cornelius Van Til twists and takes a different approach to apologetics. He is known as pioneering presuppositional apologetics. He taught at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia up until 1975. And from the influence of Abraham Cooper, but he was also influenced by the classical theologians such as B.B. Warfield that we just looked at. He really had both, but he tends to side in his approach to apologetics with Cooper and his understanding, and writes quite a bit on Christian apologetics from an approach that is presuppositional. And by this time, we're going to have different methodologies, distinct methodologies, be put out into the field of Christian apologetics. So let's just take a look at those. Dulles actually divides them up this way. I've kind of condensed and put two of them together. He divides them into 5 areas. I've condensed it down to about 4 areas just to make it simpler to understand. First, you have the classical approach, which I've talked about and traced through this lecture, where he uses classical approach uses rational arguments to demonstrate God's existence, his nature, and then it uses evidence for the historical truth of Christianity. It sees both of them as necessary steps to establishing and giving a systematic argument for the Christian faith. The evidentialist approach ignores or denounces or does away with the arguments that demonstrate God's existence for whatever reason, and instead just emphasizes the historical or perhaps other evidential reasons, experience, for example, for Christianity. The presuppositional approach, as I've mentioned before, and I've thrown kind of the Reformed epistemology, which I'll mention just briefly with respect to this issue, kind of clumped them together. Some would say you can't do that, but I think there is reason to do it because there are some similarities. I won't go into great detail, but I think there are some similarities between them. First of all, the presuppositional approach is a reliance on certain presuppositions. Now, different presuppositionalists are going to have a different starting point. Van Til will start, for example, with the Trinity. Assume what is true from Christian scriptures and simply compare that with someone else's view of God that's not a believer. That's all you can do, and according to his approach, because there's no other common ground. He doesn't believe that he has common ground in natural reason to argue for the existence of God, so he has to say, here's my God, the Christian God, the triune God, and there's your God. Your God can't do certain things such as explain life and reality and so forth. My God can do that. Therefore, you just should jump ship and come over and believe in my God. That's really, to a certain extent, the approach that a presuppositionalist would take in doing apologetics. Reformed epistemology, we'll talk a little bit about Alvin Plantinga. But Reformed epistemology is really this notion of warrant for belief, or what we might call justified, is based on the analytical understanding of justified true belief. Here they'll say that belief in God isn't different than any other belief that we would have, and therefore we have warrant for believing. For example, if I believe that I ate cereal for breakfast this morning, I can't philosophically demonstrate that to be the case, but they would say that that belief isn't any different than me having belief that God exists, and therefore I don't really need reasons or evidence or argumentation to be given for the existence of God. I simply have warrant for believing it because I have the same beliefs in other things. And then the last area has to do with an accumulative case or a combinational approach to apologetics. This is where is somewhat newer in terms of its understanding of apologetics. The later half of the 20th century, early 21st century. Here they want to combine. They look at all the different apologetic methods and they say, none of them really just get it right in and of themselves. So let's just take from the different apologetic methods and let's take from whatever else we need to take from, combine it all together, and kind of make a person-centered approach to apologetics. Combine it all together and give an argument that is more geared towards meeting a person's need for hearing how we argue for Christian apologetics. Now, I'm not going to argue for the value of any of these approaches. In fact, we're going to do a whole section on methodology where I will go into much greater detail, arguing that the classical approach still stands today. And I will argue there that we may find some helpful things in these other approaches. But nonetheless, I think the classical approach is the correct approach to doing Christian apologetics. And anyone that would reject the classical approach or the central elements of the classical approach is simply just not doing apologetics the way it should be done in terms of Scripture. Well, who are the major classical apologists? Well, there are many of them. I'll give you a few. Norman L. Geisler would follow Thomas Aquinas in his understanding of metaphysics and epistemology. Very well known, very popular apologist, as well as a scholar in his own right with regards to apologetics. He's the author of one of the texts that you're reading, Christian Apologetics. Also, his other classic work, if you're interested in reading more about him, would be his Philosophy of Religion. Richard Swinburne writes quite a bit on the existence of God. He takes a different approach than Dr. Geisler. He's not Thomistic in his approach, but he is well known as a philosopher and probably one of the leading philosophers with respect to the existence of God and arguing for the existence of God. His approach is to be more hypothetical and scientific in the issue, while the Thomistic approach is to be more demonstrative philosophically in the issue, but nonetheless very well known, and Dulles cites him as being in the classical apologist camp. And then the third individual I would bring up is William Lane Craig, who actually studied at Trinity under Dr. Norman Geisler, but he in his own right has become a very well-known, active debater in Christian apologetics, particularly concerning the existence of God, and he favors the Kalam cosmological argument. Arab philosophers during the medieval time period, and Bonaventure, a Christian philosopher, he's revived that, written about it from a modern standpoint, uses it quite effectively. We'll spend quite a bit of time on the Kalam cosmological argument. Uses it quite effectively with atheists, and he also argues quite extensively for the resurrection of Jesus, and has written several scholarly as well as popular books on that as well. So again, these are probably the most prominent Protestant classical apologists in the latter half of the 20th century and early 21st century as well. The evidentialist, there are many, but these are probably some of the predominant ones. An evidentialist is someone who, again, really sees no direct use or need classical arguments for the existence of God. Instead, go directly to the historical evidence for Christianity and use that in order to make their case for Christianity. John Warwick Montgomery and Gary Habermas are very well known for doing this, writing prolifically in this area, as well as Dr. Habermas debates quite a bit in this particular area. But they do not see a need for arguments for the existence of God. They believe that you can argue historically and want someone to be persuaded to believe in Christianity based on the historical evidence alone. The presuppositionalists, of which there are many in various systems, we've talked about Van Til. Francis Schaeffer is rightly put in the presuppositionalist camp as well, but he does differ from Van Til. In fact, Van Til wrote a rare paper that actually distinguished his approach from presuppositional apologetics from that of Francis Schaeffer's approach. Francis Schaeffer does seem to see a little bit more value in terms of apologetics from a livability side of it, and while he doesn't completely embrace arguments for the existence of God, does differ in his approach from Van Til, and starting with the Trinity. He's more grounded in comparing worldviews, perhaps, than some of the other presuppositionalists in their approach to apologetics. The other individual I would point to is Carl F.H. Henry, who has written quite a bit on it. There are other people as well. In fact, there's many that differ quite a bit, but follow in a similar vein of being in the camp. Gordon H. Clark, Edward John Carnell, who some would put in the combinational camp that we'll look at in just a little bit, would trace their roots to the presuppositional approach. Gordon R. Lewis, John M. Frame, all these individuals have written texts describing their approach to Christian apologetics. Now, I just briefly mentioned Reformed epistemology. Some would say this really isn't a approach to apologetics. Actually, it's an epistemological understanding. As I mentioned before, if you remember, this says that beliefs such as the existence of God aren't different than other very basic beliefs. Since we have warrant for those other basic beliefs, then we simply just have warrant for our belief in God. This is more of a epistemology. Tries to show that knowledge of God is not different than our knowledge of reality or of other minds. These other things aren't demonstratable by more basic things, hence it's not needed that we demonstrate our belief in God by any other means. Hence, embracing the truths of theism and Christianity doesn't really require any assent of reason for many people, they would say. Apologetics, as traditionally understood, may show warrant for belief, but it's not always necessary to do that, and often it's not necessary at all. I bring this up because it is an undergirding a lot of approaches to apologetics, particularly this one in Introducing Apologetics by James E. Taylor. I wrote a review of this book in the Christian Apologetics Journal. In order to show that really his approach is to favor Plantinga's critique, but then you might say, well, then what's the need to go on and do apologetics? Apologetics at this point just becomes something that's helpful for some people. While he'll admit in this book that arguments for the existence of God do not achieve their intended result, that is, demonstrating the existence of God, he'll say and argue that some people may find them helpful, so because some find them helpful, here they are, let's discuss them and give them. This is quite a deviation from the classical tradition of doing apologetics. This is, again, resting it on a completely different approach to epistemology than what has been used traditionally. Our final approach to apologetics in the later half of the early 21st century is this accumulative case or combinational apologetics. These are some more recent trends. They'll trace their origin back to Edward John Carnell. Some people would put him in the presuppositional camp, regardless of where he's put. This is the approach that kind of takes this accumulative case approach of combining other methods as well as other kinds of evidence together and trying to be focused not so much on the apologist method achieving its goal or its end in and of itself, but gearing it towards a person. If someone comes along and questions God, then we might very well take arguments from classical apologetics and help this person out. But if someone comes with some other needs, existential needs, we certainly wouldn't appeal to classical apologetics. We would appeal to existential apologetics and help this person out to see the relevancy and the need of Christianity. Its approach is to say that none of the approaches to apologetics in and of themselves are correct, and we need to combine them all together and use and take from them as the need arises with respect to the individual. In fact, in my ministry project that I did research in this area and surveying various Christian schools and their approach at the secondary level. And the most common approach to doing Christian apologetics was this combinational approach to doing apologetics. And so this is quite prevalent within the Christian community, that this is the understanding and approach that we ought to take to doing. Some other people that have suggested this and lean towards in this direction are Ronald B. Myers in his book Both and A Balanced Apologetic, David K. Clark in his Dialogical Apologetic, Kenneth Boa has written Faith Has Its Reason, which, by the way, is an excellent, well-reasoned book in terms of presenting history of different methodologies of apologetics. It has a brief chapter on history of apologetics and explores the four basic kinds of apologists, and then in the end kind of applies apologetics. It's a book well worth your reading. Very well written book, and I do commend it to you, although I would disagree with his final critique, or his critique of classical apologetics in it, and I'll respond in another lecture to some of those issues that he brings up. So finally, in the end of this survey of apologetics, let's integrate a history with where the systems kind of developed. We have the period on the one side with respect to the period of formulation. We have the developmental periods of the New Testament church fathers, the Middle Ages, the modern period, all the way down to the contemporary period. And I've classified, if you remember, all the way back with the patristic fathers, the early church fathers, I said that their approach was mostly reactionary. Really, there's no real way to detect any consistent system that's present there. What they have are objections that are raised, again, to civil issues or the civil government, or objections that are raised with respect to religion, and they just answer it as best they can at the time, and that's their approach, is kind of react to the needs at the moment. Origen is the predominant major philosopher and apologist of this time period. And the description I give there to it is to respond to religious objections, problems, or misunderstandings concerning the Christian faith. During the medieval period, apologetics comes to its height. It is here, especially with Aquinas, that apologetics is given its systematic expression, arguing from ground zero to the existence of God, and then arguing through history, through miracles, and so forth for the truth of Christianity. This uses rational arguments to demonstrate God's existence, His nature, and then evidence, particularly historical evidence, for the historical truth of Christianity. Going into the modern era, we have experiential approach, which would be Kierkegaard's fideism, as well as an evidential/historical approach, which is beginning with Joseph Butler. The experiential approach shifts away from arguments for the existence of God. Remember the influence of Immanuel Kant, to blind faith acceptance of Christianity. The emphasis evidentialist is on historical or even other evidences for Christianity, but mostly historical. And again, here is negating the role of arguments for the existence of God, or completely doing away with them. The contemporary approach, we have been dominated by presuppositionalism. Remember the influence of Immanuel Kant in doing away with arguments for the existence of God, leaves no common ground between the believer and unbeliever. Hence, the starting point is a Christian presupposition over against the views and beliefs of a non-believer. For Van Til, he starts with the Trinity, or we would put Reformed epistemology in this camp. Alvin Plantinga and his approach, looking at warrant as a presupposition as well with respect to this system. Then the final one we looked at was the combinational approach. Most would trace this back to Carnell, where it combines various apologetic systems and uses them as a need to argue for Christianity. And so this is the survey that I'll give you with respect to it. Again, it's a brief survey. Many people, many works, many issues have been left out, and I would commend to you Dulles' work if you're interested in filling in some of the details that I've left out. But nonetheless, I think this is a good overview to give us a good start to approaching the topic of doing apologetics in this class format. and we give you the background I think you need to understand some of the issues that I'll raise later on as we proceed throughout the class.